Welcome to the Dennis Report. I'm Dennis Atchison. The major theme of the Dennis Report is to show how everything's connected. To do that, we give our guests lots of time to dive deep into the topics they have much passion for. And along the way, sure enough, we start to learn how this piece connects with that piece, connects with this piece. Underneath all of that, we start to learn our province has the potential to create a new narrative about how we talk about how we live together. So today we're going to give you segments from 4 different shows that will touch on Crown lands, it'll touch on the labor movement in IBEW 37 for NB Power, it'll touch on healthcare, and it'll touch on a major topic these days, pensions. So we're going to start with Crown Lands and Ken Hardie, the General Manager of the Woodlot Owners Federation of New Brunswick.
The woodlot owners, there's 41,000 woodlot owners in the province. We own just a little under 2 million hectares of productive forest. Our key business over the years, through the associations I represent, the 7 marketing boards, is the selling of forest products, or selling logs, studwood, pulpwood. So it seems counterintuitive if you put more crown wood into the system, and yet government's contending there'll be opportunities for us. That's probably one of the key things we're having a hard time understanding.
Okay. So there's an issue of balance or access, or where the development should happen or the growth should happen?
Well, fundamentally it's market access.
Okay.
And market access for private woodlot wood has been an issue for over 20 years.
Yeah, there's stuff about price points, and I remember reading news stories with small woodlot owner operators saying that I can't sell enough wood to even cover the gas for me to, as gas prices went up. Yeah, so, I mean, here's an ad, you know, that it'll cause a chuckle, but it's an Irving ad about on track for the largest purchase of woodlot wood ever, which is probably true to a degree, but it doesn't give you the detail of what it's like from the woodlot owner's point of view.
Well, Dennis, you're right. In fact, they are probably going to buy more woodlot wood this year than they have in the recent past. But you have to understand that in some, especially in some regions, in the province overall, but in some regions, we're essentially in a monopoly situation. There's nowhere else to sell your wood. If you live in and around Sussex, New Brunswick, for example, there's only one place to sell your wood. That's to J.D. Irving Limited. And secondary to that is the best way we could describe our relationship is probably quite rocky these days between the marketing boards and the Federation and J.D. Irving. So that wood is all being purchased basically on their terms. There's no negotiation.
It sounds like Walmart. When Walmart goes to the manufacturer and says, here's what you're going to make this product for, otherwise we won't carry it on our shelves. Yeah,
and I mean, you know, privately in meetings, you know, because we still on occasion do talk with JDI representatives, you know, they portray it as being a really good thing. But the real sad pawns in this thing are the producers, the contractors, the guys with the trucks and the chainsaws and the equipment. They're trying to make a living, and they have no choice. They have no negotiation rights. So it's essentially, here's the price of wood, take it or leave it.
The outside of the realm of that detail, something else crosses the mind really quick. At some point, it's a finite universe. Like New Brunswick isn't very big in terms of global market competitiveness, or even on what we produce in forest products nationally. I think I read somewhere once that New Brunswick was like 2% of the national total of forest industry in general terms. So for us it's big, but on a bigger scale, when you change the scale, what happens if something changes out there? China changes and India changes. And reading the Irving announcements, last week with going back into the mills and investing, you know, $500 million plus into retrofitting. When interviewing Peter Linfield on the show in the past, he talked about the forest industry is going to go through some major changes in the next 20 years. And New Brunswick might be well advised to start looking for other alternatives or other uses instead of what's always worked since the 1950s and 60s. Does that cross your guys' path at all? Like for those small woodlot owner operators, that's their one thing they've got. But do they have any radar up that at some point this is going to have to change?
I would say that most well-informed folks in the forest business on private land and woodlot owners, they watch the news and they see the print media and they understand that and they understand the effect of the housing crash in the U.S. and what it did to lumber and they understand, well, you only have to look at a map of Canada, and New Brunswick isn't a really big place, but forestry has always been king here in terms of wages and GDP. But we do need to change. I guess the point I would make, Dennis, is because you often hear, especially Mr. Irving himself, will talk about, we're in a global market, we got to be competitive. We understand that and we respect that. But as a producer of wood, we're not selling our pulpwood in a global market. We're selling our wood in New Brunswick.
Yeah. And don't you sometimes wonder, well, who decided that's the way it has to be? Not from the local market one, but the world market one. Like, who decided that's the way it has to go? It isn't necessarily a foregone conclusion that that's the growth pattern. Maybe it needs to be a zero growth pattern rather than in order to succeed, we need to keep growing. At some point, that logic stops.
Well, I think you're bang on. I think we need to take a step back and look at how our industry has matured, and I think there's things we can do better. We should be better at it because we are smaller. We should be able to adjust quicker.
Yes.
We should be much more flexible.
Well, earlier you'd mentioned that this should be a good news story, and yet all of the friction that it's going to and has elicited is taken away from that good news story, like where you're heading now with.
Well, yeah, that's what I was saying in the lead-in before is, the news that there's going to be a large influx of capital, improving mills, creating jobs, should be a good news story. And I would suggest that David Alworth, our Premier, and the government has missed an opportunity. If they had just taken a little bit different look at how they rolled out this strategy, it could have been a much more positive outcome. And I'll explain that briefly, if I may. Is the industry wants more wood in order to make these capital investments. Makes sense. We, as woodlot owners, we have wood available sustainably. Like, we're not cutting up to our maximum annual allowable cut, that what I mentioned earlier, that sustainable level. So we have wood, whereas the Crown land, which is public land, you always got to remember that's public land, is essentially maxed out. And that's why the environmental conservation side is so excited, because they know that wood's going to have to come out of those deer yards and those stream buffers and the old growth forest. If the government had a little innovative, and it could have been a real positive thing, because they could have maybe instituted some policy or some recommendations that a portion, we're going to support you in your investments, Mr. Industry. Here's some Crown wood, but you need to purchase some private wood, balance it out. Everybody potentially could be a winner.
So somewhere in behind the scenes is the logic that when you access Crown lands, it's somehow cheaper or more cost effective than buying it from small woodlot owners. Meanwhile, is that right? That would be an industry perspective? Because why would they be wanting to go there if there's already supply coming from the other sources that creates the spin-off back into the province and keeps your team busy?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of it has to do with the economics, the pricing, because wood off a Crown, the pricing is set in a very convoluted process, and how they access the licensees, especially the system we have of licensees and sub-licensees, access to Crown, they have exclusive access. So they have total control. So the control component is, I would suggest, almost as important as the pricing, because they can control everything. Whereas in the woodlot sector, you got to deal with 7 marketing boards, negotiate,
Okay.
You know, so
Yeah.
it's a little bit more complex.
And is there a revenue stream for the industry side from the government? Like, does the government pay the industry side at all for management of Crown lands? Do they make?
Yeah, and that you know, that's, you've hit the nail right on the head. I mean, because of transparency issues, I would suggest with the government and how the government puts the information out. But to answer your question directly, yes,
Okay.
they get paid a set figure. They used to be referred to as overhead. They now call it forest management expenses.
Okay.
And it's essentially the costs. It's to compensate the industry for the costs incurred of managing the piece of Crown land that they're managing. That number currently is $5.15 a cubic meter.
Okay.
So, for example, hardwood pulpwood, the royalty rate is I believe $7.53 a cubic meter. You take that $5.15 off of it. So, hardwood pulpwood, the royalty rate, what they have to pay back to the government is $2.37.
That's the balance.
You know, whereas if they're buying private wood, the prices now for private wood at hardwood pulp users is in the $44, $48 a cubic meter range. But to be fair, the price I'm quoting for wood, that's delivered to the mill. The royalty rate the industry pays, they have to cut it and get it to the mill.
Yep.
But still, and this is where it gets very confusing, is those royalty rates for the different products are set by the government by doing what they call a fair market value survey of stumpage prices on woodlots. So we've always contended in the period of the survey is usually done by a consultant. They hire a consultant to do it, and he
Third party
surveys.
objective, more or less.
But they're using us. So we contend essentially if industry can keep our prices low, especially in the period of the survey, then that in turn has the effect of making their royalty rates on Crown go down. And that's probably not a really good explanation. There's other people that could explain it better than I, even though I understand it. But that's what the general public don't understand. Is the assumption is, and common sense would tell you, that those prices would be set by looking at what the market's doing, how products are performing, you know, hopefully on a North American basis, maybe even a global basis, and then the government would set. And then, Dennis, the ultimate bottom line is the fact that people have to understand our Crown land loses money. Between that payment they get paid for forest management expenses and what gets paid back as royalty, the difference 2 years ago was a $15 million loss.
So it's a net loss to the people of the province.
Yeah, you and I, and we're all subsidizing that essentially.
Yeah, that's part of that. The activists that talk about corporate welfare stuff or the way money streams. So at that point, though, has it always been this way? Is this a recent phenomenon? Can this go back to the 60s?
It goes back to the best of my knowledge, it goes back to '82 when the Crown Lands and Forests Act came in.
Ross Galbraith is the business manager for IBEW Local 37. IBEW stands for International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. You may know them as the MB Power Union. Ross is going to give us some insight into labor movement, behind the scenes a little bit on what goes on for MB Power and the line workers when a storm hits, and some overview on the good things that unions do that media never cover.
I think that our power has been so reliable in New Brunswick. We've had very good reliability compared to some other jurisdictions, right? That sometimes folks forget that it is an essential service, and then how different our lives can be when we don't have electricity, right? It's easy to take it for granted when up until this last year, many people might go years without having an outage, and even if they did, it was maybe only a few minutes, right?
Yep.
It does go to show you that this wide-flung infrastructure that we have, when we have big weather events or other types of things, it can create some problems. Utilities are very good if it's just a storm that hits one area or another, but when you get widespread damage across a large geographic area, it makes it so hard to fix things, right? Or if you get a lot of physical destruction, such as Arthur, when all the trees pulled,
Pulled everything
the
down.
wires and poles down, like you just can't reinstall that stuff overnight. It takes a long time to do it, right? And so I think that these big weather events do, bring it to the forefront of people's minds. And I know that, one thing that the IBEW across North America, we've always been strong advocates of making sure we maintain a power system that's reliable for everybody, right? And there's two extremes for that. One is you could have a line worker standing in every corner, and then on the other extreme you don't have any line workers, right?
Yep.
And we're somewhere in the middle there, and I think that when things like this happen, it reinforces the message we've been trying to say, that it is an essential service, like our healthcare system, or and other things where we really need it. So hopefully it'll allow us to maintain what's been a very reliable system, and hopefully it will continue to be reliable going forward.
So following that theme then, is it hard to get traction in the larger social conversation with the need to invest in infrastructure? Because it'll get into that push-pull about what the priorities are.
That's right. So it's challenging. People today, it's hard. The economy's been hard with a lot of things, a lot of things that have happened, right? And I know that folks will see their power bill and they'll say, "Look at my power bill," and it's too high. And but it's not like a private company, and there are some private power utilities where they're shuffling profits off to shareholders that may live anywhere, right?
Yep.
And this is a crown corporation, and any profit they make, they're either paying down debt, resources they've used to build infrastructure, or they're putting it back into the system to maintain it and make sure it can stay reliable, right? And we've had times over the years where governments have imposed zero rate increases, and that's great for the consumer, but it does have an impact, right? Because then the utility will be forced to do things with maybe fewer resources than would be wise, and eventually it can catch up with you, right? So Every Tower's done a very good job, but there's other utilities where they've done a poor job, and people have certainly paid the price.
That brings up an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
People in general think linear, so we want to have cheaper power. I don't want my power bill to go up. We're in the middle of an election right now, but the theme runs past elections. We want smaller government, more efficient government. But somewhere down the road, it gets too thin, too lean, or it never looped back into the essential service. So that those people calling for smaller governments or less money on public infrastructure, at some point, it'll come back to find you in another form, another day, another way. So how do we have a more fruitful conversation about that instead of a conflict-based or a crisis management conversation? Because by then it's almost too late. For scrambling because these towers needed to be replaced and we waited 30 years too long.
I think that's the challenge, right? Because if you're just trying to put food on your table, that's your most immediate concern, right? And the bigger picture, or even other public services, like in Atlantic Canada, we know that there are high levels of low levels of literacy. Something like 56% of Atlantic Canadians have low levels of literacy, right? And so that would suggest we need to put more money into our public education system, right? But if you're a government and you've got X amount of resources and you're saying, healthcare system, education, this, that, and the other thing, it's easy to kind of say, well, maybe we're going to put it over here and not invest in as much as an education, or maybe we're investing more but it's still not enough, right? Because the literacy levels are still low, right? The long term, that will cost more money.
Yes.
But in the short term, it allows you to get it by. And I think that's a problem just with the system a little bit, in that it is more focused on what do we need in the next, if you're a business, maybe the next quarter or the next business cycle. If you're a government, maybe the next election cycle. Taking a longer term strategic vision, is a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, but it's maybe not happening as much as it should, right? And I think that society has to get a handle on that, because at the end of the day, like you said, we will pay the price one way or the other.
Yeah, because all of the pieces are connected.
Yeah.
So that begs almost a better conversation.
Yeah.
because we stay within the same paradigms all the time. So here's all these competing needs at the table. So here's the infrastructure needs for guarantee of power supply. Here's the healthcare needs for that, education needs, and it's always brought to the table as competing needs. There was a time, to turn it a touch, when unions were very proactive in creating social change back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, for some of that traction for the new ideas to finally have some momentum and some mass, because unions could bring their mass to it. So the weekend and paid leave and all those are almost archetypal now things from the movement. But there's a whole new series of challenges in front of us. So maybe in a way the conversation from IBEW or from you starts to get us on a more positive shared strategy grounds. Have you ever run into the opportunity to actually make that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, like, I'm very proud. That's the way I try to do things. I mean, I think I have that bigger picture view, and I do look at things, and I know through the years, I've been active on behalf of the IBEW here in New Brunswick around things like, what's the right electrical system for the province? Like, what makes the most sense? Because, you know, we've always, our major message is we want a system that's reliable, because we live in this province and our families live in this province. We want it good, right? Yeah. And focused on things like that. And I know that, you know, my local, we've, before my time, it started before me, but we've certainly run with it as a, you know, comprehensive training and education program for our members. It's focused more on soft skills, more so than technical skills, because then people are, they're transferable, right? Because you either the kind of soft skills, whether it's communication or conflict resolution, you can use that in the workplace. You know, it's important skill sets for anybody. But also when folks leave work, you know, they're coaching that softball team or they're involved in their community. And so those things help, I think, our communities be better. And so definitely of, you know, my union and my local and other leaders within it, we've, you know, focused on those types of things, like kind of the bigger picture things, and we do our job day to day. You know, another area we talk about, and hopefully we're continuing to push for positive changes around safety. You know, that's something we've come a long way, but there's still more that we have to do. And you know, it's funny, I had an opportunity, we had some union leaders visit here from Argentina, and you know, they wanted to pick our brains around safety, and 2 years later I had an email from one of them, and they'd been successful in achieving some positive legislation in their country. So you know, I'm proud of things like that, where you can help others, you know, not just here in New Brunswick, but live safer, more productive lives, right? Yeah.
I like to riff down the union themes message a little bit. For the most part, generally today, unions are kind of put in a box about they're only looking after themselves. And much of what you've already said already branches into how it's so much more. So some of that is the general public's perception that unions are just self-interested and they jack up costs and all that negative stuff. But unions are also responsible to be agents of social change, but they need to change their messaging a little bit too in order to get that to resonate. Sounds like you've had some success with how that could be.
I think so, you know, and some of the things I've been involved with over the years, like one of the things I noticed is that, you know, if a journalist contacts you frequently, you know, I think the stereotype, well, if this happens, what's the impact on jobs, right? And, you know, when we talked about the electrical system in this province, that would be the question would come up. And, you know, I don't want to be pigeonholed, you know, because I think our interests are wider than that. And so, you know, I would, you know, steer more into the area of, you know, what we want, because we are citizens of this province and our families live here and our friends. We need a good system that's reliable for everybody, right? So instead of focusing on what might be impact or jobs or not, or impact on wages, it was really about the bigger picture that I think we all have a shared interest in, right? And so, you know, I'm mindful of that there are stereotypes that I don't think reflect most of the union leaders I know. And so I try to steer away from those and talk about the other good things that we're doing, because hopefully, you know, we can educate folks about what we're up to, and you know, it's so frustrating, you know, if there is a labor dispute. And I know last year in the IBEW, so, you know, 700,000 members across North America, in our system, if a local union gets to the point where they think it's necessary to have a strike, they need to seek approval of our international president. Okay, so last year I think there was only 5 or 6 times that happened, and only I think things that were strikes, and they were both settled very early. I'm pretty sure those are the numbers. But the average person in the street might think that unions are in a strike all the time, and we're not. So when we do something and we can resolve something, or we strike a deal that's really good and it helps the company where our members are employed be successful, that's not news. It's not sexy. It doesn't get reported, right?
Yep.
So all people hear are the bad news things, but the bad news is this much of the good stuff.
Yeah.
Mile marker, count 'em off, son. Between what once was and what's begun.
Penny Ericson offers us in-depth and passionate understanding of the healthcare system. Her many years' experience, not only as a Dean of Nursing at University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, but also as an advocate for patient care and for systemic change within healthcare systems, makes her an unbelievably important voice to listen to how things can come together better for the people of the province.
But we have an acute care system based on the Medicare system, and we never put in place the other half that was supposed to be there, which was the community half, the half that takes place, when you're not acutely ill, but how to keep you well. And we were successful with the acute care system because it was designed for the things that were problematic 50 years ago, when we didn't have chronic illness to such an extent that we have today. So today, the big ticket issues that are challenging people's health are the result of cigarettes and alcohol and too much food of the bad kind and too little exercise. And these things are not cared for quickly in an acute care hospital. So we have a lot of dollars going into a system that's designed for acute illnesses, and these aren't automobile accidents. These aren't these big issues. These aren't trees falling on people in the woods. These are lifestyle issues, and they need to be addressed so people will maintain health or attain health and keep their health, so that when they do need an acute care hospital, there is one that's accessible, smaller, and able to deal with that problem efficiently and effectively. But all the other health issues really should be addressed in a non-hospital environment, using the school system. I mean, in the old days of post-World War I and post-World War II, you had public health nurses who were in the schools, and they've evaporated. But we
do have a Department of Public Health, don't we? Or,
we do.
But it's under-resourced?
Of course it is, and it's not part of the school system. And public health visits, all new mothers used to have a nurse come to the house and check on her well baby, and now they will do that if there's a high risk assembled. But as a mother of four, I had 4 kids in 6 years, I think any new mother is at risk. The learning curve. The mother has made a lifestyle change that is dramatic. And after your baby's born, your endocrines are going nuts, and if you're feeding the baby, you're sleep deprived, and if you don't have any help with that, you're really sleep deprived, and you're overwhelmed with this task of this wonderful little human being that's come to live with you 24 hours a day and doesn't say thank you.
Says thank you in different ways.
By sleeping or occasionally blowing a bubble.
There we go.
But these are health care issues that need to be addressed, so that when people are growing and changing over the lifespan, they are in a healthy position to deal with those changes. And right now, we don't have the supports for that in our system now.
So if it was points to intervene in a system, that's one of the spots that needs to be addressed, is catching people at home with lifestyle. Yeah,
and even now, without making a new program and setting it up, there are all kinds of things that could be done, and I've been asking for this for the last couple of years. Hospital waiting rooms have TVs. A lot of doctors' offices' waiting rooms have TV. don't plug in game shows and don't plug in the news. Plug in information. You know, there's all kinds of it out there. You can plug in all kinds of information on that television that will talk to them about how to prepare food, you know, for a family of 6 on $10, you know.
It's a great idea. You could just have the television plugged to the internet and just have a pre-listed script of YouTube clips, and away you go.
Of course, you know, and what to look for is side effects and drugs. Or now summer's coming. How important is it for you to keep hydrated? You know, what is the difference between looking at a poison ivy rash and, you know, something else? You know, these are important things for people to know. And hopefully a lot of that information will keep them from going to the emergency room in the first place.
Yep. It's like that easier access than the 800 line that they set up once upon a time. It's probably still there, not once upon a time.
It's still there.
We never hear reports on the frequency of use or the reach or that kind of thing.
Well, speaking of reports, I think one of the things that has been happening in New Brunswick over the last couple of years, which is phenomenal, is the development of the Health Quality Council. And Stéphane Robichaud is chairing that committee. And what they have been able to do is gather data so that our decisions are based on solid research. Because a lot of the decisions were being made without really knowing what was happening in our province. You might know what was happening in a small community or a region, but when you look at it provincially, we weren't sure where the pockets were that needed the most attention, and we were getting skewed information from interest groups or the one-on-one very human response to a particular sadness that happened in a particular family.
Yeah, it's powerful. Yeah. New Brunswick's an interesting challenge that way, because in general terms, our expectation level is that of a larger province. People expect, you know, stuff in their backyard to a degree, but 780,000 people roughly cannot sustain a certain kind of infrastructure, which is where equalization payments come in, and that's why they're there. But managing the people's expectation levels and the access to care is always a tough one for New Brunswick, because... Well,
it is, but I don't think it's as tough as people would like to use it as an excuse.
Yeah, I mean, a 2-hour drive in other provinces is not a deal. That's considered close.
And I think everybody knows that we don't have an endless budget, and most New Brunswickers live pretty close to the margin. And so they understand when money isn't there. So they're very willing to see change. As long as the change means that they still have access to health. But I don't think that they have to have access to health by having every piece of equipment on every street corner, and they don't either. You know, they've done a lot of roundtables around this province, and people know perfectly well if they're going to drive to St. John to have Thanksgiving with the family, or they're going to drive to Lamech to go to a concert, or they're going to drive to Campbellton, you know, to see Aunt Millie, they will go somewhere else for an MRI, or they'll go somewhere else for a surgeon who only looks after thumbnails. You know, I mean, they will, if the need be, they will travel. And if there needs to be assistance with the travel, well, that is cheaper than trying to have all of those things on every street corner. We have everything in place. We don't need any more money on studies. We don't need any more money doing assessments. We've got extramural. And we have a social services department, a social welfare department, and these people are there. So if we need a few more to do a few more assessments, hire the people. Don't dump your money into a bunch more studies. We're studied to death. You know, just give us the people, free them up, and let them do the work.
Now, our final segment involves pensions. Major topic, much discussed in New Brunswick and across Canada for the past 2 or 3 years. Our 2 experts, Cyril Theriault and Brian Durelle, give us a snapshot and a deeper understanding not only of the math, but of the basic organizing principles behind a pension, and they also give us suggestions as to where we might go in the future.
I also got involved quite early
not only because I worked in pensions, but my college roommate became a life insurance agent. So one of their jobs is to market to people they know. So when I went to work in pensions, he went to work for Canada Life. And so he was on my back. And I think my second year out, I made an RRSP contribution.
Really?
I don't know if it was really voluntary or not, but I made one. You have to understand that Canada's retirement system is based on a three-legged stool. And that three-legged stool is comprised of government-sponsored programs. And I don't mean in this case a provincial government-sponsored program, but the Canada Pension Plan, the Old Age Security Plan, and the Guaranteed Income Supplement under the federal government. Then there's the RRSP component of it, whereby the federal government allows people certain tax deductions to provide for their own retirement. And then there's the employer-sponsored pension plan, which the province of New Brunswick has many employer-sponsored pension plans currently to offer their employees. And they've been negotiated with certain groups over time.
Yeah. And that's what I think Cyril was talking about, the Canada Pension Plan. And when I first started, everyone has to make mandatory contributions to income tax, Canada Pension Plan payments, UI, or employment insurance as it's called today. So even at a relatively young age, you knew part of your salary was being offset for a Canada Pension Plan, that at some point in the future you get a return on that investment.
Yeah.
So
that's the Canada Plan, or Canada Pension Plan. But both of you have gone through a fair number of negotiations and lots of long-term experience. So the whole notion of pension, as it's spoken of today, sounds like this huge benefit. And it's like it's coming out of nowhere, not something that was planned over a long period of time. And so getting across the message that it was part of my compensation package from 30 years ago, as opposed to this benefit that I'm getting, that word benefit kind of hangs a lot of people up. Sounds like extra, rather than, can you speak to that process of the financial strategy or some of the logic to the deferred wages over a 30-year period of time?
I think you're putting it in a good way. And the way I look at that is, the theory is offer and acceptance. It was a contract of employment, which had many elements of it. And part of that was your base salary, and then there were things like sick leave, vacation time, health and dental coverage, group insurance, and sometimes in the private sector they'd have company discounts, use of company vehicles. There's various elements that go into the total reward structure. And the pension plans the province have got into, those are in fact referred to as deferred wages. And I remember, and I was telling this to Cyril earlier, that I sat down one time and negotiated with our lawyers who were trying to argue they should be paid the same as private sector lawyers. And I was arguing no, because private sector lawyers have to generate fees to set aside sufficient money for their future. In your arrangement, there is a defined pension plan where we contribute to that, you contribute, and there's a guarantee, and there will be a payout in the future. So those are your deferred wages. And that was subject to a conciliation effort by Ines Christie, who is a respected law professor at Dalhousie University. So I find it kind of odd we're at the end of that situation now, and I mean, people will talk about highly paid public servants, but I do know we've had lawyers that were not paid market rate because they were getting these deferred wages. They had choices to make.
And I think that's also true with the case of doctors. In some cases, even nurses, although now nurses seem to only work in the hospital environment. As far as recent phenomena, you have to remember the Public Service Superannuation Plan, which is one of the major plans that the province carries. It commenced, I believe, in 1932. And from 1932 to 1966, it operated as an independent pension plan. In 1966, the federal government implemented the Canada Pension Plan, and that was also during the Louis Robichaud years in New Brunswick, where we also had equal opportunity. So right on the heels of the introduction of the Canada Pension Plan, we had province-wide collective bargaining. And that, I think, was 1968. So then the hospital workers and the school board workers all came under the Public Service Labor Relations Act and were deemed provincial government employees. Before that, many of them weren't. They worked for the hospital or the school board.
Or the county.
Or the county.
So this is 68, 66, somewhere around there?
68, yes.
Yeah, so now it's umpteen years later, umpteen decades later. So unions are often tagged for driving up the cost of things. You can't be competitive if you unionize, that sort of stuff. So when collective bargaining kicked in and pensions were part of the compensation package, did unions kind of miss the boat on the messaging a little bit, that this is part of deferred wages as opposed to this benefit that shows up later? Because today's language is, oh, don't you, those gold-plated public sector pensions, blah, 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 and don't you raise my taxes? And it gets noisy in a hurry. And if you know where it all started, maybe there's some clarity can emerge from that.
Well, there's two pieces to that equation. The private sector negotiations are governed by the Industrial Relations Act.
Okay.
And there's no prohibition to getting into discussions on pensions or benefits or salaries or anything else. Basically, you can use strikes and withdrawal services and those types of things to try to strike some type of a deal.
Would this tie to the NACWIC situation?
Well, that's the
8-9 years
situation
ago?
in NACWIC. NACWIC, they had some, they paid some pretty good wages, private sector wages comparable to other private sector companies that might have been based in New Brunswick. And it's our understanding that they had a pension plan and they had some difficulties with that, but we're led to believe that the employees didn't contribute to that pension plan. It was solely the company.
Oh, employer only.
Yeah, and that might not have been unusual at the time, a company of that nature, of that size, and so things were going well. But unfortunately, the nature of the business they were in, there was a bad cycle.
Yeah.
Now,
and that gets into legislation to protect the pensioners and the queue of people looking to collect from a company that's gone bankrupt.
Correct. And I think that's part of the reason why the government brought in the task force initially in pensions, was to look at NACWIC and Fraser's to tighten the rules so that they didn't find themselves in those circumstances, because those plans were already subject to supervision by the superintendent of pensions. So how did it get to that point that that money was sufficient or was available to the company? It should be in trust.
Which gets to that linear stuff the media use, this causal effect that, oh, we have a pension deficit, therefore equals got to raise taxes. And
You also have to remember that under the Public Service Labor Relations Act, that piece of legislation bars employees and their representatives from negotiating the provisions of the Public Service Labor Relations Act and the Teachers Pension Act.
Okay.
The hospital workers and school board workers, other than teachers, they were always free to collectively bargain their pension plans. And they did.
Okay.
Every 2 or 3 years, whenever they had negotiations, they bargained. And they didn't bargain for decreases.
Well, that's an important point Cyril's bringing up. Like in the public sector, there's a restriction on staffing. The unions cannot negotiate how people are hired or how many people are hired. And they're also not allowed to negotiate the Public Service Superannuation Act, the pension plan, or the teacher's pension plan.
So this is where unions would say they don't have a voice in their own pension plan, so I gave you my money for 30 years, but I didn't have a say where it went and how
that's
it
where they're
went.
coming from. It was compulsory. The rates that you had to contribute were set by the province, and you had no choice. You become a public servant. You had to contribute to those plans. And secondly, because you were part of that plan, part of your T4 would give you what's called a pension adjustment, and it would limit how much you as an individual can contribute to your own RRSP.
So there were ceilings on it. If we could slide back a bit to values, because you got talking about the private sector and some of its limitations, but there was a value-driven thing there too. So NACWIC is an example, or maybe other private sector companies. Do you think it was part of their retention strategy, recruitment and retention strategy? Because I think on the government side, that was always one way to, let's go work for the government, I'll work for a percentage less, but it comes with Blue Cross and a pension plan. But the private sector used to use pensions as a retention and recruitment strategy.
I'm sure that was part of their theory and their game plan at the time. And some of those arrangements, you have to remember too, that if you walked away from your employment in your company, sometimes you would forfeit certain things because there's a vesting period. You'd have to stay in for 5 years, or in case of the members of the Legislative Assembly, it's 8 sessions. So you'd have to stay there at least 5 years, or you would walk away from that
You'd leave it behind.
company contribution, you leave it behind. So it would be like a retention tool from that perspective.
All right.
And in many cases, the money left behind by people who left early, that was there to help benefit the people that remained, thereby lowering the employer's cost into the pension plan. But over the years, I think it used to be, there was actually a age 45 for vesting. And if you left before 45, you forfeited the employer money. Well, that is currently under the Pension Benefits Act, is down to 2 years. So if you're there 2 years, you get everything.
Okay.
So that's increased the cost of pension plans.
You talked about social background, and a lot of people don't appreciate it, but at one point, if a woman became married, she was not able to belong to or continue to contribute to the pension plans. And it's not that far back. You'd have to go to find that out.
Pre-66, I think.
Yeah, and there were a lot of public servants that would be perhaps on a part-time basis, they're not allowed to contribute to the pension plan. So there was a defined contribution set up, and it's on a voluntary basis. It was called the part-time and seasonal, where people could do, there's a matching of 4.5%, that type of thing. So there were different types of plans. But
Well, this is
The
fun.
other, the other thing, one other important point I think to make, especially under the Public Service Superannuation Act, is we mentioned it started in 1932. It was until the fiscal year 1975-76 until the province of New Brunswick put a dime into that plan. It was always just employee money. And then in 75-76 they put in, I think, 3.6 million, and then the next year they started matching contributions.
Okay.
So when you said, oh, Nakawick was paid 100% by the employer, the public service plan was paid 100% by the employee.
Employee. Interesting. Back pieces. Well, can we slide then from that to, don't lose it because I had it, because it was about the public sector, because we were playing between the difference between private sector and public sector. They both had some similarities, which is retention and recruitment of talent. Private sector maybe paid a little bit more. Public sector didn't, and that was part of what you accepted working for public sector. But that's another era now. And now in the current era, the language or the values or the emotions in and around, you have a pension and I don't, because one sector held okay and performed okay. So you can find lots of research and studies that show that public sector pensions over the past 10 years have just done fine, thank you very much. If you could speak to that a bit, that would be fun. Which then conversely, why the erosion on the private sector side?
Well, I think a lot of that goes to, on the public sector side, you've got some sophisticated organizations like the New Brunswick Investment Management Corporation, and there's some highly skilled professionals. Like John Sinclair is a person that could probably write his ticket in terms of where he wanted to work in Canada in that business. And if you look at, since 1996, they've done very well. They've more than met the requirement of the actuary to fund the pension plan. But they're very sophisticated. They know the stuff, they add value. On the private side, what happens a lot of times, you're dealing with individuals who are not as sophisticated and don't know and don't have the time. That's not their full-time job. They've got a job or a family to raise. They can't watch every day the market. So I think in some cases like that, you put the onus on individuals who are at least able to look after those affairs, and they may have left their investments in risky side stocks when they were older and didn't have as much time to recoup those losses. If you're a young individual, you might take more risk. It's profiling.
Yeah.
And so when you shift the balance from DB arrangements to DC arrangements, you shift the onus more to the individual. And I think some people are getting caught that way.
Yeah, and a lot of times those phrases, defined contribution, defined benefit, are thrown around like they're understood, but there's an awful lot of math and assumptions that go in behind it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
In the intro, there was a piece that I used from the website research that showed a study done by CBC, because all this commentary from the banking industry was that pensions are in a mess. But when CBC went and did their study, they found that public sector pensions are doing just fine, which then gets into why the need to change, or now that we're in another era because young people don't have access to a pension. The model from the 50s or 30s doesn't sort of work in 2010 to 2015 to 2020. So how do we build a new model based on the old values, but give the public a better understanding of where this all came from, and how do we get everyone to buy into it? It's a nifty question, but you kind of get my gist?
I think I do, but I'd just like to say that although the public service plan started in 1932, it has evolved greatly since that time, and it wasn't designed in 1932.
And if I can interrupt on the public sector plan too, another thing you hear a lot of is that the government took payment holidays or contribution holidays. Is that accurate? Is that a right phrase for that, or is there a better understanding we could have of that?
There's a long explanation that goes with that, and it's probably best to have an accountant here.
And a lawyer?
Not necessarily a lawyer.
Well, to cover what the accountant says.
Well, because it's the accounting rules where you have different kinds of actuarial valuations. Like you have a going concern actuarial valuation.
Okay, good.
That figures out the cost of the pension plan on an ongoing basis to provide benefits.
Okay.
Then you have an accounting valuation that's based on different assumptions than the going concern valuation.
Okay. It'd be like management's best guess on some of those assumptions.
And that calculates a pension expense that you have to put on your books, but the pension expense isn't related to the pension contribution, really.
Okay.
So sometimes you can have a pension contribution, but a negative pension expense.
Here's an example of what he's talking about.
I think I got you.
Well, maybe I can clear it up a little bit. Like, for example, an actuary is required because of his certification, his profession, to manage within certain parameters of the assumptions in terms of interest rates and all those other types of things. So he would make those kind of assumption changes within that. But in the accounting valuation, management may say, yeah, we know you're expecting a 2.5% or 3% annual salary increase, which impacts the valuation, but we know we're taking 2 years of freezes in the next 2 years, and we want some value for that. So they might substitute that for 2 of the years, so there'd be a difference in the number.
Okay.
The other thing I wanted to bring out is that some of the plans the province are in are accounted for on a defined contribution basis. Like the two that settled on the new shared risk plan model, for example, the acute hospital workers and the nurses. Their plan was already accounted for on a defined contribution basis. And what I mean by that, the expense for government was simply related to what they paid into the fund. That was it. They didn't have to worry about gains and losses and changes in assumptions, any of that stuff. It was just, what did you put in? That's your expense. So in fact, they did take contribution holidays on those plans when they were in great shape years ago.
Good.
So there's a distinction. There's like 12 plans that the province is involved in. Yeah. For example, the members plan, the MLA's plan, there's actually no fund. It's charged, the expenses of that are charged directly to the consolidated account. So there's no charge to a fund.
Okay. Maybe to bring it back to a more surface thing.
What can we do?
We're in March.
Yep.
Pretty soon the Finance Minister Higgs is going to be announcing the budget. Somewhere in that budget discussion is, here's our pension liability. And I remember Victor Boudreau in 2009 saying it was $350 million. And I always wondered if that was a real number. And you've just touched on kind of where that number comes from. And then, you know, people like Charles Sirtwell from Atlantic Institute on Market Studies, or Kevin Lacey from the Federation Taxpayers stuff, will say, oh, taxes are going to go up to cover off that liability. But I always wondered if it was a real number, or if it was a conjured up number based on accounting principles.
I guess it's a number that's determined by the actuaries.
Okay.
And I indicated they have to make a number of assumptions. They have to make assumptions on demographics, on mortality tables. They have to make assumptions on inflation rates. They have to make assumptions on what's the rate that employees are going to get paid in terms of wage increases. And the other thing that the retirees and employees don't control is the size of the workforce, which is a major driver of your costs and contributions. And the employees and retirees have no say over how much you pay people or how many people you hire.
Right.
So
it sounds like a mixing board. You're in a sound studio and they're mixing a record and there's all these levers that they're moving up and down to create the right harmony or the right resonance. It sounds like there needs to be a mixing board for...
Well, I think you're right. There's things, what I find is, because if you look at the Investment Management Corporation's annual reports, you'll see that they've met their target and they've done very well, as you've indicated in that piece you talked about earlier. Yeah. I think it was the CIBC president or somebody talked about the markets doing very well in the public. A lot of volatility comes from interest rates. When interest rates are high, if I promise you $1,000 down the road, then I don't have to set so much money aside. The interest rates added to that will accumulate and give you $1,000. But if interest rates drop down, then I have to put more money into the market to get to that $1,000. Well, interest rates go up and down in large scales, and it's interesting when the market interest rates drop and drive some of the accounting and the pension stuff, it actually is cheaper for the province to borrow money.
Complex. Did you want to add? I cut you off a little bit earlier.
Well, I was going to get back to your question that you had concerning what can employees now and what can the governments now do to make sure people have retirement incomes going forward. And we touched on it briefly when we started, that right now the federal government has been going around the country and discussing retirement planning. They discussed, and it seems to be a bit off the board now, improvements to the Canada Pension Plan. They discussed the pooled registered pension plan, and it has to be adopted by provinces and rolled out. And it's much like a group RRSP. They've talked about other things, like how can we encourage employers to have pension plans? And it's difficult. Probably one of the best routes is an expansion of the CPP. But there has to be a lot of study done because the CPP is more than just a pension plan. It's a disability program. It has a bit of survivor income in it. It also has death benefits in it. So do we want to expand that whole thing or just the pension part?
When you give people time to finish their thought and to offer in-depth knowledge, passion, and understanding of a topic area, you also get the experience that you're building something larger than each of the parts. It's a collective conscience and a new narrative of how we can come together to make New Brunswick and Canada better. The theme of this show is how everything's connected, and we hope that you enjoy this and continue to watch the program. If you wish to see the full episode of each of the people we've put on today's segments, please go to YouTube and check out the Dennis Report, or go on Facebook and look for the Dennis Report there. Again, thanks for watching, supporting the program, and as always, be good, have fun, and love each other.
Mile marker,